Good morning, everyone. I hope you have been enjoying the conference this far, as well as our fantastic lineup of speakers who have given generously their time to share insights and experience. We've had very rich and helpful discussions in our breakouts following the presentations. It has been really encouraging to hear how much you have all appreciated and enjoyed that time to share and learn from one another. Yesterday, we had a member of the House of Representatives, Dr. Anne Ali, join us to give a keynote presentation on the impact of the pandemic on social cohesion. She highlighted that social cohesion is more than just the absence of discord or disunity, and to be able to use it as something that can be operationalized to create a better society, but also in times of crisis. She emphasized the idea that the aim of all our policies, not just for social cohesion related policies, should be the well-being of all, to fight marginalization, promote trust, and offer upward social mobility. It should be a framework that underpins all our policy aims. I think that is something that is a takeaway for all of us, that whatever social or economic initiatives we implement as a society, we should consider in its design how it is also fostering those elements of social cohesion. So now to today, day 4 of the conference. This session we have Reverend Tim Costello giving a keynote address on social and economic injustices and their impact on social cohesion, followed by the Youth Commissioner at the Victorian Multicultural Commission, Khayshie Ramesh, who will present on the same theme. Now to introduce our speakers, I welcome my dear colleague Shafali Williams, who has been intimately involved in facilitating a number of the Inclusive Narrative Roundtable discussions held last year. Good morning, Shafali, and I will hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Ida. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome. Friends, I'm joining you from the Australian Capital Territory and wish to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners of this land, and indeed acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Many participants in the roundtables this past year raised a number of social and economic injustices which impact our collective ability to become a more socially cohesive society. The systemic nature of these injustices were made more apparent during the pandemic and also show that we are all impacted by them, regardless of our diverse backgrounds. If there is one thing we have learned from the pandemic, it is how interconnected we are. We have 2 presentations this morning. Reverend Tim Costello will be speaking to us about social and economic injustices we face in Australian society and their impact on social cohesion. We are very grateful that he has been so generous with his time. Reverend Tim Costello directs Ethical Voice and is one of Australia's most respected community leaders and a sought-after speaker on issues dealing with social justice, leadership, and ethics. Reverend Costello was Chief Executive of World Vision Australia for 13 years until October 2016. He then completed over 2 years as World Vision Australia's Chief Advocate. Currently, Reverend Costello remains as Executive Director of MICA Australia and continues to place the challenges of global poverty on the national agenda. He is also Senior Fellow for the Centre for Public Christianity. He remains a spokesperson for the Alliance for Gambling Reform, which campaigns for law reform to prevent harm from poker machine gambling. Other positions he holds are Chair of the Community Council of Australia, Chief Advocate of the Thriving Communities Partnership, and Patron of the National Youth Commission. In 1997, Reverend Costello was named as one of Australia's 100 National Living Treasures. In 2004, he was named Victorian of the Year. In June 2005, he was made an Officer of the Order of Australia, and in 2006 was named Victoria's Australian of the Year. With this awe-inspiring resume, I'm really looking forward to gaining insights from Reverend Costello's presentation, as I'm sure all of you are. I encourage everyone to put questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and please join me in welcoming Reverend Tim Costello.
Well, good morning, and I too want to acknowledge the Indigenous owners, custodians, elders of the land that I'm on, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations, and acknowledge their leaders and their emerging leaders. So I want to take a step back before naming particular social and economic inequities that affect social cohesion and inclusion, and maybe go big picture and then bring it down, land this plane in terms of what this means in Australia. The big picture is that over the last 200 years, we have seen the advance of both the market and the state, often at the expense of what we call civil society. They are communities and religious groups and all sorts of voluntary associations that really are the third pillar to the market and the state in terms of a flourishing society, particularly in terms of advancing social inclusion. The market and the state have commanded those high peaks by really a very simple idea that the individual is sovereign, and the individual expresses their wishes in the state with voting and competed for by parties to get their vote, usually on a policy of look what we're doing for you, look what's in your self-interest. The market commands the same heights of the individual's preferences and the individual's choices. Plugged into the market system, we'll see the market allocate resources efficiently and distribute consumer goods spitting out to bring happiness to the individual. The communal side of that, which is civil society, actually has been relatively languishing, certainly over the last 200 years. I was very struck when two Americans wrote two books. One was Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart, in 2012. He comes from the libertarian right, Charles Murray. The other is Robert Putnam's book, Our Kids, written in 2015. Robert Putnam comes from the communitarian left. Both of them focused on communities and drilled down in depth in America. Both found that segments of the American population that used to live close to one another and interact and generally belong in the same world had, particularly since the early 1960s, completely diverged, drifted apart. The well-off and well-educated had prospered, while the less successful and poorly educated had become progressively more deprived. Both writers said these Americans no longer inhabit the same social spaces at all. As career and remuneration diverged, they have physically and materially separated. Their children now have totally different expectations. For both Murray and Putnam, this is not a minor fact. This questions the fundamental American proposition that everyone is equal in opportunity, if not in outcome. So great is the gap between the top third and the bottom third, that equality of opportunity no longer genuinely exists in America. Social mobility and inclusion have effectively evaporated. Now, this strikes at the very idea of America. Its central narrative was that whoever you are, with sufficient dedication, you could reach the heights you wanted. They said this no longer rings true, particularly for a very significant portion of the population. Since the 1980s in America, the top 10% in income of the population have more than doubled their income. The 60% under them, the bottom 60%, their income has been static. Well, in Australia, we have seen similar trends, just not as exaggerated. And we have certainly seen in Australia the same evaporating of confidence that we are all in this together. 65% of Australians, according to the Edelman Barometer on Trust, no longer are sure what is true or who to trust. Well, we think of royal commissions into children, royal commissions into banking, royal commissions into mental health, royal commissions into aged care. Essentially, all these royal commissions are dealing with the fact that there is something that has gone wrong in these areas, and we no longer trust what have been institutions that expressed a common good to do that anymore. Trust is pretty fundamental to social inclusion. You see, the word credit, which we need in finance, comes from the Latin word credo, I believe. So does the word fiduciary, which is a financial trust relationship. It comes from the word trust. What we are describing is that neoliberalism, which has now been dominant in Australia and in America and lots of other parts of the world, neoliberalism has shown us that without morals and trust, markets can't function and even politics can't function. The coming apart in America, which we've seen in this last election, nearly 72 million voting for President Trump and Make America Great Again, really was a cry that the American dream, that narrative, for so many, they believe has died. Well, when we think of market economies, we have to acknowledge they have generated great real wealth, eliminating poverty, liberating human creativity, doing it much more than any other economic system. Democratic capitalism has lifted all of us in terms of prosperity. Neoliberalism at that work has certainly worked. But now there is this crisis. It's become very, very clear markets cannot guarantee equity, responsibility, or integrity. Markets cannot be relied on to distribute the rewards fairly, the rewards of growth. When self-interest, which oils the wheels of the markets, is central, self-interest not only doesn't guarantee honesty, it actually shows us that markets aren't moral. Morals are not made by markets nor the state. Morals come from civil society, communities of service, volunteering, in association, shaping, forming young people, giving them higher ideals that the ancient Greeks understood. They called it eudaimonia. It meant joy. That was, for Aristotle and others, the purpose of life. It's been a shift from joy and eudaimonia to hedonia, happiness. Now, joy essentially is the transcendence of the self, and that happens in communities, saying there is something greater in serving others. Happiness is a victory for the self. So I'm really saying a shared morality is essential for society. Essentially, that we exist for others, that civil society has always understood but has been languishing. That civil society is the we. It's moral bonds binding us together. Call it faith, creed, culture, custom, convention. Neoliberalism has preferred the freedom of the I to the equality that comes from those things that bind us together. And we know it's sort of an illusory freedom. Individual freedom, we often think, is absence of restraints. Actually, true freedom is choosing the right restraints that you learn in communities that want to serve others. An individualistic universe may be free, but it's fraught with loneliness, isolation, vulnerability, and nihilism, a prevailing sense of meaninglessness. We literally become and live alone together. Mother Teresa, by the way, said, and the greatest and worst poverty is loneliness. Mother Teresa knew something about poverty, the worst poverty. For her to say the worst poverty is loneliness is quite a dramatic statement. We know we can communicate instantly across the globe, but we find it difficult to chat with our next door neighbours. We know that individualism and the freedom that comes with us often corrodes relationships. And relationships are the most valuable and value-creating resource in any society. Relationships are the lifelines to survive, grow, and thrive. That's what civil society, that third pillar of a good society, alongside market and the state, actually provides. So what I'm really saying is, if we're going to be talking about equity and social cohesion, we need a little less of we, a little more of we, and a little less of I. We need to name that the rights of the individuals, taking precedence over collective common good rights and responsibilities, is the real challenge. So let me just then, in the remaining time I've got, talk about Australia against that backdrop. What I've tried to do in that setting is say, let's go deeper. There aren't simply political and technical and economic decisions that, without understanding where we've come from and the place we're in, can actually solve these questions of social and economic inequalities and social exclusion. We need to go deeper on the we and acknowledge the shift from we to I. In terms of the challenges facing us, these will all be very familiar to you. So let me just paint a thumbnail sketch of them, and we can pick up wherever you like in the discussion that follows. I've spent 25 years of my life saying, why does Australia have 20% of all the world's pokies? 20%. If Americans' blind spot is guns, ours is gambling. We have the greatest losses per head of any nation in the world. Losses from gambling per head that are 30% higher than the nation that comes second in losses. Well, if you overlay a map of where the pokies are with a postcode of where poverty is, they perfectly fit. This has been predatory behaviour of a machine built for addiction that has stripped the poor, particularly, transferring massive resources to the captains of the gaming industry and to state treasuries. I've been on Breakfast TV, ABC this morning, about the Crown Casino and its failure to be able to get its license and open in Banger. Just extraordinary predatory behaviour, money laundering, which translates into drug assets, selling ice to our kids and others, and breaking up communities. The second issue I want to name is Indigenous Reconciliation. I don't think I've ever felt more shattered than when that magnificent Uluru Statement from the Heart was presented and dismissed within virtually 24 hours by Prime Minister Turnbull. Barnaby Joyce, Deputy Prime Minister, said it's a third House of Chamber, it's not happening. All untrue. It never was a third house, it was simply a voice. And what depressed me was, in my long exposure to Indigenous issues in this country, I've heard my mob, us whites, say, well, when Indigenous get together and agree on what they want and stop fighting, then we will listen. What happened at Uluru, after consultations right across Indigenous Australia, was they came together and got on the same page and said with a beautiful statement what they were asking for, and it was dismissed like that. I grieve that the Senate last week wouldn't even fly in NAIDOC week the Indigenous flag in the Senate. We know of Indigenous disadvantage, but we know that deep down it is connected to profound questions of you matter, we see you. We acknowledge your 60,000 history here and that you were here. Those questions, relational questions, are at the heart of it. Well, then I think of the young. We know that education in Australia often causes great disparities as a product of a private school, quite a high fee paying school. I now know that I was very privileged, that there's 30% of the population that get to go to what are often called Ivy League schools, while often in the state sector, particularly in the poorest areas, the resources don't flow equally. We know with our young there is profound questions about now their future. I am glad the government did what it did with the coronavirus, a virus, by the way, that helped us rediscover the we. Invisible virus helped us rediscover the we, that we are biologically connected and equally vulnerable, from Donald Trump to Boris Johnson to Tom Hanks to Prince Charles. Anyone, not just homeless, exposed to the elements can get the infection. But in the spend, massive debt now for the next generation of young people. And our tax system has its benefits flowing to my generation, baby boomers, negative gearing, superannuation concessions, capital gains exemptions, a tax system that we now need to reorient in a fair way to the young, starting with what I believe is an inheritance tax. Most other countries of the world have an inheritance tax where if you die wealthy, up to 5% will go back to the state for future generations of young to pay off that debt. Another category is our poor. I am still shocked that the government hasn't promised and locked in to what was called New Start, now Job Seeker, a hefty increase. It's cut again the increase that we got under coronavirus. I simply don't understand why there is such an aversion to spending for people who are poor. This is absolutely shocking. I am very encouraged that in my state, Victoria, there's just been a social housing package announced of $5 billion. I went into local politics, became mayor of St Kilda on a platform of social housing. St Kilda, where I was mayor, has 15% of housing stock that's now social housing. Most of Australia has under 4%, most other cities. Why is there homelessness? Because we have not invested in social housing. At least the Victorian government has made a serious commitment in the last week. Finally, our environment. We lived through those bushfires, witnessing them, hopefully giving to those whose houses were burnt down. We know whether it's rising sea levels, more volatile weather, we are in the midst of a global crisis. We are. And it's my generation that's largely saying, well, we won't be here, and don't you affect our lifestyle or affect our giving. And that has got to be wrong. It's the younger generation, the Greta Thunbergs, with moral clarity saying, can't you see what is going on? That is an ultimate inequity. And in World Vision terms, the impact of climate change was already profound on the world's poorest people. They live on the most marginal land in the most vulnerable areas. Wherever I went in World Vision work, I saw already that profound impact, already devastating the poor. So there's just some issues I'm sketching in terms of the social inequities, not saying there's just a political fix that's simple, but if it's a we, not I, if it's civil society that's actually teaching morals and trust, again, becoming an equal pillar with just the state or the market, then I have hope for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. You've given us a lot of food for thought. You've spoken about the science of consumptionism, which I can barely get that word out, being advocated by the market and state. You've spoken about the disparity between the rich and poor getting worse. And then you've spoken about the shared morality, which has to come from the civil society, and how we can move more towards the we than the I. And I hope that some of the questions that we explore later we'll be able to explore some of these points in greater detail. I'll now introduce Khayshie Tilak Ramesh, who will also be presenting on this theme, building on Tim's ideas, but from a youth perspective. Khayshie serves as the Youth Commissioner at the Victorian Multicultural Commission. She is a passionate advocate for the inclusion of youth voices and diverse communities. Khayshie is an active member of her local community in Bendigo as youth mayor and chair of the City of Greater Bendigo Youth Council. She also co-founded and served as vice president of Young People for Refugees, a youth advocacy service in Bendigo. Khayshie was recognized as Young Citizen of the Year in 2017 and was named in the top 100 future leaders. Join me in welcoming Khayshie. Over to you, Khayshie.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Khayshie Tilak Ramesh, and I'm the Multicultural Youth Commissioner Victoria. I would like to start by paying my respects to the traditional owners of the land, which we are all gathered here today. I'm speaking to you from the lovely regional town of Bendigo, which are the lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung and the Taungurung peoples. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the land and waters of Victoria. I would also like to pay my respects to any Aboriginal people who are attending this event today. I would also like to acknowledge Reverend Tim Costello. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. I'm always taken aback by your ability to contextualize such complex concepts into such simple and core values by putting aside the jargon and talking in terms of simple things like I and we. I too question how we continually rationalize compromising the livelihoods of our most vulnerable communities for the sake of economy and keeping the working dream alive, especially for us, we're young people, where these working dreams are often unattainable, mostly by nature of systemic inequality. In preparing to speak to you all today, I honestly did not know where to begin. but after hours of thinking, researching, and reflecting on conversations that I've privileged to have been heard from our diverse communities during COVID-19, I arrived at the conclusion that the sentiment of not knowing where to start is actually quite fitting within the social cohesion space. A socially cohesive society is not easy. It's defined by the United Nations by being one whereby all groups have a sense of belonging, participation, inclusion, recognition, and legitimacy. More specifically, the Scanlon Foundation outlines 3 common elements to social cohesion. The first being a shared vision of universal values, mutual respect, and common aspirations. The second, a well-functioning community with shared goals, responsibilities, and readiness to cooperate. And the last and final being the commitment to a continuous and never-ending process to achieving social harmony. This formulaic approach to social cohesion caused me to reflect on my own experiences, thoughts, and recollections of where I think we are as a nation in terms of these 3 elements. This being from an intersectional lens of being a young, multicultural, regional, female, diverse person in a role whereby I've been fortunate to have a front row seat to social cohesion efforts, especially during COVID-19. Today, I thought that I would use my time with you to share some of those reflections. I believe that multiculturalism and diversity within Australia is widely accepted. Diversity is one of this state's and this country's greatest assets and strengths. Our culturally diverse society encompasses people with origins in over 200 nations. Here in Victoria, over half of all Victorians were either born overseas or have at least one parent born overseas. And almost 60% of Victorians follow more than 130 different faiths. But while multiculturalism is generally accepted, and we arguably have this first component of social cohesion ticked off, the shared visions, values, and mutual respect, how deep that acceptance goes, and our continual commitment to it, I think, is another question. It is one thing to celebrate alongside our multicultural communities and our young people during festivals and periods of fortunate economic growth. But it's another thing to show up for these communities when times are tougher on us all. When racism is at its absolute peak, or after a negative news event whereby the most accessible and easily targetable community and scapegoat are our multicultural youth. Moreover, as Tim Costello so rightly touched on, self-interest drives markets and the nation and the national working dream. Therefore, it's even harder to find true acceptance of minority communities when our own interests and benefits are seemingly threatened and challenged by minority communities merely being acknowledged and factored into budget and solutions. This made me think about the second element. A well-functioning community with shared goals, responsibilities, and a readiness to cooperate. Amongst the many conversations I've had with our young people during this pandemic, I think the most useful and accurate analogy that I've heard is that our society right now is like a smooth porcelain vase, with little hairline fractures that are only visible to select people at particular perspectives. However, COVID-19 was a light bulb that was placed inside this societal vase, which illuminated the cracks that were already there, but made them apparent to communities who may not have been exposed to such realities on a day-to-day basis. We saw conversations started around housing insecurities, youth unemployment, mental health concerns, economic insecurity, and a lack of accessible resources for multicultural communities, just to name a few. But what this did do was create urgency and presented opportunities for collaborative grassroots initiatives, whereby different communities and levels of society and government and business came together to share the burdens and responsibilities, and they were ready to cooperate to create effective, resourceful, and fast solutions for cohorts that were vulnerable and in need. It was and is incredible to witness, and I sincerely hope that we don't lose this momentum and community spirit anytime soon. This brings us to the final element of social cohesion, according to the Scanlon Foundation, this being a commitment to a never-ending push for social harmony. I'm incredibly optimistic, exactly because of conferences like this, where these conversations are only beginning to be had at the higher levels But if all you do tonight is close your laptops and go back to your daily lives to talk to one person, your friends, your family, someone in your community, about what you can do in your place to create a safer, more inclusive space for our diverse communities, that there is what exactly sparks the change. True progress lies in taking the time to champion lived experience, empathizing with our diverse communities, and building solutions alongside them with them in the room, instead of without them or building it for them without consultation. It's about taking the step back from our own tables and recognizing the systems and structures which put us there that also happen to be the exact same systems and structures that are keeping other people out of those rooms. It's about starting the uncomfortable conversations, which are not easy and they're not very palatable to call out sometimes, where incredible leaders like Tim Costello are using their platform to highlight injustices within social and economic spheres, delivering and championing these sentiments within structures and around tables that were never built for minorities. In summary, social and economic inequalities and inequities are merely symptoms and causes of a lack of social cohesion within Australia. And the fight for a more cohesive and harmonious society is a continuous process of questioning what's around us. In addressing my initial question of where do we start, I believe that the answer lies in what we do when times are hard on us all to foster cohesive societies, especially when no one's looking. Tim Costello put it perfectly moments ago. A shared morality is essential to society, and there is no better time for social cohesion than during a shared recovery period where we're all hurting, to show up for each other and push for holistic approaches which don't leave communities behind. After all, in questioning how socially cohesive we are as a nation, we are only as strong as our most marginalized cohort. Thank you.
Thank you, Khayshie, for your presentation. It is said that youth can move the world, and hearing and learning from a youth like yourself really gives the rest of us hope. You've already, there's questions coming in, right, left, and center, and we'll get to that in a minute. But you've already answered one of them. If there's one practical thing that an individual can do to work towards this unity and harmony and social cohesion, and you said, shut your laptop and go and have a conversation. And both you and Tim have, used these words of consultation, conversation, and if that's one thing we can do to build, and it will promote social cohesion in our, that's one little drop in the ocean for this powerful movement. I'll start with, how does an understanding of our inherent oneness or common humanity help us to alleviate the injustices we still face in Australia? Can you describe elements of our common humanity?
And let me just say, I thought what you said, Khayshie, was absolutely wonderful. I love the alabaster with fine hair cracks in it. So I think the whole basis of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was actually shaped by a Catholic social thinker. He said, I didn't want to write into it my beliefs of the immortal soul and that everyone actually is sacred and has dignity. So he used secular language. Jacques Maritain, his name was. But I think you do need a transcendent view of the profound connection, awe, beauty, and sacredness of life. I think that the loss of that with what I'm just calling technocratic solutions that will, politically fix this or do that, is where you lose a picture of what this organic dignity of all of human life is about. So the oneness, for me, comes from a religious perspective. You can answer it from a philosophical perspective, but that's where I come at it from. So to really answer the question, I'm saying the challenge is not simply to have conversations in economic technocratic language, but to have conversations about things that have a transcendent dimension. That is fundamentally important to both listen respectfully, to understand more deeply, to give the dignity to others that you really want to understand. I think the only question most humans have is, do they matter? That's the profound question I think all humans struggle with. And I think having the ability to listen deeply, to go to deeper meaning questions and ask those questions is really important for that, what I call transcendent view of human oneness.
Thank you. Khayshie, what do you think young people or other marginalized groups feel true participation in the growth and development of our country will look like, and how can it be fostered?
Yeah, I think this is a very pertinent question for right now, where I think we've done significant moving and that people understand that consultation is the way to go. But I think there's a whole other uplifting of cohorts that can happen when we empower and build capacity, but also move out of the way for our young people and for different diverse cohorts to move forward and actually take a seat at decision-making tables, rather than creating a whole new table for them, such as, it's the difference between electing a young councillor versus creating a youth council. Why are we creating more barriers for participation at higher decision-making tables when we could invest in the people who will know the solutions from the very get-go and put them on the table itself? So I think in terms of how we create these solutions, it's looking at where are the tables that we're sort of at, and what can we do in our own capacity to create space for people? What can we do to build capacity? And this could start at so many different levels. And something that I always talk to the young people that I mentor about is the fact that we're all mentors. And there's always going to be somebody who would love to speak to you and would love to hear what you have to say and benefit from your wisdom. And we need to reach out and find them, because it's hard for them to reach out and find us. So I think when we're looking at inclusive decision-making, seat at the table is definitely something. The second one is definitely finding people and tapping them on the shoulder to be included, but also checking yourself throughout the entire process. Because while it's disheartening to create a solution and realize that it's not going to work, you are creating the deepest impact if you're creating sustainable and relevant solutions that may need to go back to the drawing board a few times than creating something and sticking by it because you put a lot of time and money into it.
Thank you. I actually had a question of my own for both of you. When I was just reading your CVs, that you both lead such a coherent life where service and just leading a normal everyday life is seamless. It's not compartmentalized that now I'm doing some service, or now I'm helping someone, and now I'm living my life. So what would you say to just any person on the street if they wanted to do something, or if you wanted to inspire them that it's achievable? Even if you're really caught up in the humdrum of life, this is achievable. How could they, one thing from your life, one small thing that you could say to them to inspire them, or just to get them going, that they can also contribute?
Do you want to go first, Khayshie?
Yeah, I'm more than happy to. I think for me as a young professional, I'm 23. So I confronted this question quite a lot, because in, deciding what sort of career that I wanted to pursue, you had all of these competing lines of thought, I'm going to put it. And I think Tim captured it perfectly, where there's this school of thought of the working dream. And if you work really hard and you put everything into it and you take all the right steps that someone's taken before you, it's going to get you somewhere where you'll be stable. And once I reach that stability, then I can start giving back. But I would have this competing school of thought of, what if I never get there and I never actually reach this point in my life where I know that I feel comfortable giving back and this is it. So I started looking more to a values-based sort of approach to things, where I looked at the jobs and the volunteering experiences and the stuff that I really enjoyed doing when no one was looking. Was this mentorship idea? Was this, how can I use the experiences that I've had to, tell a cautionary tale to a young person about, this is what I did and this is how I got here, or this is what I didn't do, but also to be the safe space for them to explore their own values and explore what sort of sets their heart on fire without this fear that you'll never be able to support yourself if you follow what you love and if you live that sort of compassionate side of life. So I think what I would recommend is trying to really align your career and your experiences to your values and using it as a compass. So a simple exercise I do with a lot of young people is I say that the most unproductive question that you'll ever be asked is what you want to be when you grow up. We should rather be asking, who do you want to be when you grow up? Do you want to be the person who, contributes to conversation? Do you want to be someone who is a thought leader in a space? Do you want to, create spaces that are inclusive? I don't want to hear that you want to be a doctor. I want to hear that you want to help people. Because that means that in these areas where we have economic instability, where there's job insecurity, if you lose your job as a doctor, you haven't lost your purpose. And that's what really drives behavior. Whereas if your only school of thought is, I want to be this, the minute you lose that role, it's very easy to become aimless and to be quite confused in directions. I think there's a lot of work to be done, which is kind of exciting but scary, about defining values and really living out those values in what you do.
Well, let me say, I wish I'd had Khayshie's wisdom at 23. It took me a lot longer to get to those insights. But what she said is spot on. There's a wonderful book by David Brooks called The Second Mountain. And, he talks about the first mountain being what we conquer, and it's our persona and our career. And people get to the top and they go, is that all? What was that about? And there's often wilderness and desert that follows. And the second mountain is what conquers us. It is vocation and meaning and who I want to be, not what do I want to do. Look, early on, I sort of realized there were two ladders, the career ladder, and I climbed that, became a lawyer, minister, and mayor, and whatever. But there was a second ladder, which I call the vocation ladder. And the vocation ladder starts on the first rung with, why am I even here? What's this about? I didn't ask to be born. Nobody's given me the meaning of life. Why am I here? And the second rung of the vocation ladder I discovered in my journey was when I said, what is it that if I don't do it, I'm going to be poorer and the world is going to be poorer? What is it that causes me to experience both bliss and it intersects with the world's need? And I think that vocation ladder is fundamentally important. And so I talk to people who ask that question in those terms. What is it that you both love doing and actually it has moral significance, which is Khayshie's discovery that things unnoticed and unapplauded she actually enjoyed doing, which is fantastic.
Thank you. You mentioned the market and the shift from economic growth satisfying wants to development being focused on the collective needs. In your opinion, what are the areas that collective development should focus on over the next decade?
Sorry. Well, yeah, the list of themes I went to toward the end of those areas: environment, reconciliation with Indigenous. It is the hemorrhaging of the Australian soul. We have the Australia Day celebrations, which have got to be the emptiest day in the calendar. What are we meant to do? Have a barbie, run up the flag, watch the cricket, no, actually, we're meant to, if we're really to be celebrating Australia, acknowledging who's been here for 60,000 years and why that is so fundamental to how we can be and who we can be. I mentioned areas of reform from education to gambling to the tax system. I do think the tax system needs serious reform. I was personally quite shocked that in the last budget, it was just what I call that individualistic political contract. We will lower your tax returns because, after all, it is your money, when they could, at federal level, have invested in social housing, which Victorian state government's done at least, in locking in a higher rate of job seeker, because that then gets spent straight away by the poorest people, which is the best economic stimulus, creating jobs. It just went to, in my view, and I'm not totally critical of it because you do need some pump priming of creating spending, but it was a missed opportunity. Reforms in those areas are what we need in the tax system.
Thank you. We see the I society everywhere we look. Even in our education system, young people are trained to put themselves first. How do we prevent our young people being trained into assuming that I first is the norm for social relations?
Yeah, there's a lot of my generation that look down on the young. I keep reminding my generation, we baby boomers proved the highest spending, most indulgent, worst saving generation in human history. The government had to introduce compulsory superannuation to make us save. And because we're such a major demographic group, we're like the python that swallowed the pig, this big baby boomer we still have the political power. And on top of that, look down on young. I actually have a lot of hope for Khayshie's generation. I see they are much more sensitive to environmental questions because they haven't had, which I had, free tertiary education, no HECS, no nothing. There is this sense of actually life is serious and there are questions to be asked, and I think they have a clarity that baby boomers don't have. My own kids, I'm very proud of all that they're doing. At one point of their lives, I remember when they were teenagers, they said to me, "Dad, is there any campaign you've backed that's ever won?" They just saw me as a loser. And I think I have communicated to them that being faithful to what you believe in, whether or not there is success, is actually the measure of who you are. And I think they have started to take that on. So we've had moments, but I actually always resist the baby boomer criticism of the next generation of this or that.
Thank you. Khayshie, I would love to hear your view on that question as well.
Yeah, I'd say firstly, Tim, you said it, not me, about your generation. But no, I think there's a lot of optimism to be had. And something that I've seen is within my generation, especially with COVID, is one of the first times we've had to indulge in shared humanity to rationalize the way that we see economy. So when we looked at JobKeeper payments, for example, and JobSeeker, there was a common narrative of a lot of people in my age being like, yay, money, how good. But the underlying thought was the people of my age who were already working, who were in entry-level jobs, who were making similar amounts to what JobKeeper was, were kind of shafted a little bit. They were a little bit grumpy. They were saying, it's really frustrating for me that people are sitting around, doing nothing and getting this money, but I'm doing this and getting, the same amount. How is this fair? But the real win in that was changing perspectives and looking at how we could communicate what the overall good is and moving away from the I. Because the I perspective of that was, I had this conversation with one of my very good friends where she was working in a reception job of the same sort of amount. And I said to her, I understand that it doesn't seem fair. but do you think that it's a good outcome that people can afford to live? She said, well, yeah, of course. I said, yeah. So do you think that it's a good outcome that, people aren't struggling for, food to feed their family? Yeah. Do you acknowledge that people have already bought into mortgages and they've already bought into all of these, pitfalls and debts and finances by nature of trying to keep this dream alive? Yes. Well, as much as it might not serve you, isn't it a great position that you're not in that position? That you're not reliant on these supports? That you didn't need this? Isn't that something that we should celebrate? And she had to agree and say yes. And I think that's the beauty of the generation that I see currently and the one below us, is that there's a willingness to change that I thinking to a we thinking through rationalization, which needs to be done through not attacking, but through understanding, yeah, this might not be fair, but equity never is. Equality is fair, but we're never going to get there until we exercise equity, which is calling out where there's parts of the system that are broken and parts of the system that have systemically benefited particular cohorts to bring them forward. And acknowledging that the Australian dream, the American dream of, work really hard, get really far, isn't feasible for a lot of people. Because by nature of where they started, the same amount of effort does not equate to the same end position. And that's where equity needs to come in to solve it. So I think there is a lot of hope for this, moving towards a we mentality. But I think a lot of that also does come from this sense of, existential crisis that a lot of young people have gone through, where we've been told that, the economy is messed up, the environment's messed up, this is messed up, that's messed up. We need to figure out how to do it. But there's a sense of powerlessness amongst young people. So I think there's a real opportunity for people in power at the moment. And I think I saw a question alongside this of how do we move the elite generation? It's asking people to step aside, because I think people are very quickly happy to say that they support young people, which means they're happy to have a conversation with the young person, which is fantastic. But where's the next step of taking that young person with you to the decision-making table, showing them that they're capable? Because there's a lot of imposter syndrome amongst young people, that they don't deserve to be there, but they're often the best place to talk to youth issues. And showing them that they have this confidence, but also showing the rest of the people around that table that young people aren't so scary and marginalized cohorts aren't so scary just because they have the lived experience that are going to create these solutions.
Thank you. And as you both can see that the questions, there's so many questions, but we've run out of time and we have to go into our breakout rooms. Thank you for all the food for thought that you've given, but also the inspiration, more inspiration that you've given to this conference and the participants. And hopefully the questions will get explored more in the breakout rooms. Thank you for your time, for your effort, and I hope that I'll meet both of you in person and not just on Zoom. Thank you. Over to you, Ida.
Thank you again, Reverend Tim Costello and Khayshie, Ramesh and Shafali Williams. That was a fantastic session, and I certainly learnt a lot from all of you. And it's given me a lot of conviction to keep moving forward in the work that I do, and hopefully you all feel the same, everyone there in our audience. And so now we make this transition from the plenary to the breakout discussions, and the purpose of these discussions is to speak more about the ideas and insights that were shared in the addresses and presentations, which can then shape those steps and actions that we want to move forward to foster high levels of cohesion and a greater understanding of how we can transcend and alleviate a lot of the injustices that we still face in our society. So we encourage all of you in these discussions to consult, support each other, listen to one another, and learn from one another as well. And there will be a facilitator to support and encourage an equitable discussion in your breakout room, who will also summarize some of the pertinent thoughts to the main plenary when we come back. Thank you very much. We'll see you soon.